February 15th, 1943, 1,430 hours. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser stood inside his command post on Kharkov's western outskirts, staring at a situation map that looked less like a plan and more like a written execution order, drawn entirely in red. His operations officer had just finished marking the latest Soviet advances. 3 Red Army formations were converging on the city from the north, east, and south. Only one corridor remained open, the southwest, and even that lifeline was barely 12 kilometers wide and shrinking fast. Inside Kharkov were the full forces of the SS Panzer Corps, 2 elite divisions, Leibstandard Adolf Hitler and Das Reich, roughly 20,000 men, around 180 operational tanks and assault guns. This was all that remained of the Waffen-SS's premier fighting strength on the Eastern Front. Yet, that alone was not the real disaster. The true crisis lay in a message delivered just 45 minutes earlier from Führer headquarters, stamped most urgent in red. Hitler's order was clear and absolute. Kharkov was to be held at all costs. No retreat permitted. The city was to become another Stalingrad. Hauser read the order twice, then returned his gaze to the map. He was being instructed to deliberately sacrifice 20,000 of Germany's best troops for a city that no longer held any real strategic value. Kursk and Belgrade had already fallen to the Soviets in the north. Kharkov was now an isolated pocket, surrounded and sinking. The question was no longer if the escape route would close, but when his intelligence officer's assessment was grim. 36 to 48 hours at most, possibly sooner if the Soviet 3rd Tank Army pushed harder from the east. Events were moving with frightening speed. Just 12 days earlier, on February 2nd, the German 6th Army had surrendered at Stalingrad. 91,000 soldiers had marched into Soviet captivity. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the first German field marshal ever to surrender, had obeyed Hitler's command to fight to the last man. Now the Red Army juggernaut was rolling westward. Operation Star and Operation Gallop had smashed German defenses across the southern front. In just 6 weeks, Soviet forces had advanced nearly 400 kilometers, leaving chaos and collapse in their wake. They had already retaken Kursk, Belgrade, and Voroshilovgrad. Now Kharkov was next, the 4th largest city in the Soviet Union. Hauser understood the cold arithmetic of modern, industrial warfare better than most German commanders. Before assuming command of the SS Panzer Corps, he had led the Das Reich Division himself. He had witnessed firsthand what happened when political doctrine was allowed to override military reality. The Soviet forces closing in on Kharkov possessed crushing numerical superiority. The 40th Army was advancing from the northwest, the 69th Army from the north, and the 3rd Tank Army was driving in from the east. Together, they fielded roughly 200,000 troops and more than 500 tanks. The balance was brutally clear. 10 to 1 in infantry, nearly 3 to 1 in armor vehicles. At 1,500 hours, Hauser's radio operator intercepted a transmission from General Hubert Lanz, commander of Army Detachment Lanz, and Hauser's direct superior. The message echoed Hitler's directive exactly, without a single word altered. Kharkov was to be defended under all conditions. No withdrawal permitted. Hauser passed a message to his staff officers without speaking. Everyone in the room understood its implications. They were being instructed to repeat Stalingrad, to create another encircled fortress, another pocket doomed to destruction, another march into captivity or death amid shattered buildings. The previous 3 days had been unrelenting hell. On February 12th, Soviet units had pushed into the northern outskirts of the city. By the 13th, heavy fighting raged in the city center itself. The Leibstandard was holding a front of nearly 15 kilometers, with barely 8,000 soldiers still fit for combat. To the south, Das Reich was stretched thin across another 12 kilometers. Ammunition stocks were dangerously low. Fuel supplies were sufficient for perhaps 2 more days of fighting. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded men who could not be evacuated, as Soviet artillery kept the roads under constant bombardment. On the evening of February 14th, tanks from the 3rd Tank Army smashed through the eastern defenses and reached the Kharkov-Pavlograd railway line. The city's final supply artery was now under direct enemy fire. Trains carrying ammunition and reinforcements were forced to turn back. At 2,100 hours, Hauser sent a formal situation report to General Lands. The tone was detached and professional, but the content was catastrophic. Defensive positions no longer sustainable. Escape corridor closing rapidly. Full encirclement expected within 24 to 36 hours. He requested immediate authorization to withdraw to the southwest while the route remained open, warning that without such permission, the preservation of the Corps' remaining combat strength was mathematically impossible. The reply arrived at 2,315 hours, and it did not come from Lands. It came directly from Führer headquarters. Hitler's decision was absolute. Kharkov was to be held at any cost. The city carried symbolic value. Preparation for a counterattack were to begin. Withdrawal was strictly forbidden. After reading the message, Hauser remained silent for several long minutes. Symbolic value. The Führer was prepared to expend 20,000 lives for symbolism, for the prestige of clinging to a city that could no longer be defended. At 0600 hours on February 15th, the morning situation reports confirmed Hauser's worst fears. Soviet troops had seized a northern rail station. Elements of the 41st Army were now less than 3 kilometers from the city center. To the east, the 3rd Tank Army was advancing with newly refueled tank brigades, pressing forward along the eastern approaches. The remaining escape route to the southwest had shrunk to roughly 12 kilometers. Soviet reconnaissance units were already testing the corridor. If artillery were brought forward, the road toward Krasnograd would become a slaughter zone. Hauser ran the numbers one final time. His 2 SS divisions accounted for nearly 40% of the Waffen-SS's total combat strength on the Eastern Front. Leibstandard Adolf Hitler and Das Reich were not replaceable assets. Their seasoned officers, battle-hardened NCOs, and experienced panzer crews could not simply be recreated, not with Germany's manpower pool already drained, not with training establishments already pushed to their limits. If he followed Hitler's command, both divisions would be annihilated within 72 hours. The 20,000 men under his authority would either be buried in the ruins of Kharkov or march into Soviet prison camps. Germany would lose more than manpower. It would lose the trained corps needed to build and lead future SS formations. If he disobeyed, the consequences were clear. Court-martial, possibly execution. Officers who openly defied Hitler rarely survived, but his soldiers would. His divisions would live to fight again. At 1,300 hours on February 15th, 1943, Paul Hauser made the choice that would define his career and alter the course of the fighting in the East. He began issuing orders carefully phrased in language every German officer understood. Units were instructed to realign defensive positions toward the southwest to strengthen cohesion. Heavy equipment that could not be securely held was authorized for tactical repositioning. Subordinate commanders were directed to conduct mobile rear guard actions to preserve the integrity of the corridor. These were not, officially, orders to retreat, at least not on paper. They were labeled as defensive adjustments, but every officer who read the orders understood their true intent. Hauser was initiating a breakout. At 1,430 hours, his operations officer received an urgent and agitated transmission from General Lands. The Führer's directive remained unchanged. Kharkov was to be held. Receipt and compliance were to be confirmed immediately. Hauser did not respond. His forward units were already moving toward the open corridor. An hour later, at 15:30, another signal arrived from Lands, this one carrying the highest priority classification. The wording was identical. Kharkov would be defended under all circumstances. Hauser read the message, set aside, and continued coordinating the withdrawal. The breakout began at 1,600 hours. The Leibstandard's 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, commanded by SS Standardführer Fritz Witt, formed the rear guard, holding the eastern approaches while the main body pushed southwest. Das Reich's reconnaissance battalion screened and protected the flanks of the escape route. Soviet commanders recognized the German movement within hours. Lieutenant General Pavel Rybalko, commanding the 3rd Tank Army, ordered an immediate pursuit. However, his armor brigades were critically short on fuel after weeks of nonstop advance. Soviet supply lines, stretched over nearly 400 kilometers of devastated terrain, were unable to support a rapid chase. By 2000 hours, the bulk of the SS Panzer Corps was flowing through the 12-kilometer gap. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, ambulances, everything capable of movement, poured southwest toward Krasnograd. Behind them, rear guard units fought a series of fierce delaying engagements to hold the corridor open. At 2,200 hours, Hauser received his final message from Lanz. The army commander was nearly pleading, invoking the Führer's name, and demanding the withdrawal stop immediately. Hauser was accused of openly defying a direct order. Hauser's reply was brief and formal. The Corps was conducting mobile defensive operations and could not comply with an order that would lead to the destruction of its formations. By midnight on February 15th, most of the SS Panzer Corps had passed through the corridor. Soviet artillery was now striking the escape route, but the main force was already clear. The last German rear guard units withdrew from Kharkov at 0600 hours on February 16th. The city fell to Soviet forces later that day, but Hauser's corps had escaped intact. Approximately 18,000 of his original 20,000 men were now positioned some 30 kilometers southwest, reorganizing near Krasnograd. The Leibstandard had suffered losses of roughly 1,200 men during the breakout. Das Reich had suffered losses of around 800 men. Heavy equipment losses were significant. 34 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, roughly 140 vehicles lost, and most of the supply depots that could not be evacuated left behind. Yet the divisions themselves remained intact. Their command hierarchy survived. Their experienced corps of officers, NCOs, and veterans endured, and that survival will become decisive within days. The contrast between Stalingrad and Kharkov could not have been more dramatic. Paulus had obeyed Hitler's command to hold his ground. His Sixth Army, 330,000 men at peak strength, had been wiped out. 91,000 survivors marched into Soviet captivity, and fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Hauser chose the opposite course. He defied orders and withdrew his SS Panzer Corps. 20,000 men pulled back in open disobedience. 18,000 survived. Within 4 weeks, those same troops would help retake the city they had been forced to abandon. The cold arithmetic of those decisions was unmistakable. Obedience had produced the greatest defeat in German military history. Disobedience had preserved the forces required for Germany's last major victory in the East. On February 17th, Adolf Hitler flew to Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's headquarters at Zaporizhia to confront what he viewed as a disaster. The Führer was enraged. An SS general had ignored his direct command. Kharkov, the Soviet Union's fourth-largest city, had fallen without a final, sacrificial defense. Yet as Hitler arrived, Soviet T-34s from the 25th Tank Corps were less than 60 kilometers away. The Red Army spearheads were so close that Hitler's Condor aircraft was forced to depart early on February 19th as a precaution. What Hitler learned over the next 3 days reshaped his view of the situation. Manstein laid out the true operational picture. For Soviet armies were stretched thin across a front nearly 400 kilometers wide. Their supply systems were strained to the breaking point. Tank formations were operating on minimal fuel. And Manstein still possessed the SS Panzer Corps, 18,000 men, and 146 operational tanks, ready for combat. Had Hauser obeyed Hitler's order, those forces would have been destroyed inside Kharkov. There would have been no counteroffensive. There would have been nothing left to stop Soviet armor from driving all the way to the Dnieper River on February 19th, 1943. Manstein unleashed his counteroffensive. Hauser's SS Panzer Corps struck southward from Krasnograd, slamming directly into the exposed flank of the overextended Soviet formations. The 4th Panzer Army attacked from the southwest, while the 1st Panzer Army drove into the Soviet spearheads from the east. Within 72 hours, the Soviet offensive disintegrated. Mobile Group Popov, the armored tip of the entire Red Army advance, was surrounded and wiped out. The 25th Tank Corps, which had come dangerously close to Zaporizhia during Hitler's visit, lost every one of its tanks. With fuel exhausted, Soviet crews abandoned their vehicles and marched back on foot toward their own lines. By March 5th, The SS Panzer Corps was once again on the outskirts of Kharkov. The city Hauser had been ordered to defend to the death was now about to be retaken. On March 11th, Hauser launched his attack, despite Manstein's instructions to encircle the city rather than assault it directly. Instead, Hauser drove straight into the urban core, perhaps determined to demonstrate that his earlier withdrawal had been a calculated maneuver, not a failure of resolve. What followed were 4 days of savage, close-quarters combat, street by street and building by building. On March 15, 1943, exactly 1 month after Hauser had defied Hitler's command, the Leibstandard once again raised a German flag over Kharkov. The city Hitler had insisted be held to the last man had first been abandoned, then recaptured by the very forces that had withdrawn. The Third Battle of Kharkov cost the Red Army an estimated 90,000 casualties. For Soviet armies were badly mauled, roughly 600 tanks destroyed, and around 400 artillery pieces captured. It marked the final major German victory on the Eastern Front, and it was only possible because Paul Hauser had chosen to disobey Adolf Hitler. Hauser was never court-martialed. Hitler was enraged, but the outcome was undeniable. The SS general who had defied the Führer had preserved the forces that delivered the Wehrmacht's last successful offensive. Punishing him would have meant admitting that Hitler's own orders had been disastrously wrong. The logic was irrefutable. Had Hauser complied, 20,000 SS soldiers would have been killed or captured in Kharkov. There would have been no counteroffensive. Soviet armor would have rolled unchecked to the Dnieper River. The war in the East would have concluded months earlier. In later conversations with fellow officers, Hauser reflected on his decision. When asked how he found the nerve to directly defy Hitler, his answer was simple. I commanded men, not maps. My responsibility was to preserve fighting power, not to create martyrs for symbolic ground. The lesson of Kharkov reached far beyond a single battle. It showed what happens when military reality collides with political illusion. Hitler had demanded another Stalingrad, another sacrificial stand for symbolism alone to A. Hauser declined to provide it. The industrial realities of 1943 meant that decisions like Hauser's were, paradoxically, both more significant and less decisive than ever before. More significant because every trained soldier, every seasoned officer, every experienced tank crew represented a form of capital that Germany could no longer replace. The training system was already stretched to its limits. There was no surplus of manpower. Every loss was permanent. At the same time, such decisions were less decisive because the Soviet Union's industrial machine was now fully engaged. The factories evacuated east of the Urals in 1941 were producing nearly 2,000 tanks each month. Training camps were turning out roughly 300,000 new soldiers every month. The Red Army could endure enormous casualties and still keep advancing. Hauser understood this arithmetic even as he made his choice. Preserving 18,000 men would not win the war, but sacrificing them would hasten Germany's collapse. By February 1943, postponing defeat was the only realistic objective left. The Third Battle of Kharkov demonstrated something else as well. The German army was still capable of winning tactical victories in 1943. Skilled commanders, given freedom of maneuver, could defeat Soviet forces that greatly outnumbered them. But such victories demanded officers willing to take responsibility, men prepared to make painful decisions, even when those decisions directly contradicted the Führer's orders. For months after Kharkov, at Kursk, Hitler would launch Operation Citadel, an offensive intended to restore Germany's strategic initiative in the East. It would fail disastrously. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again conduct a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Yet many of the soldiers who fought at Kursk were the same men saved at Kharkov. The SS Panzer Corps, preserved through Hauser's disobedience, would later fight at Prokhorovka, in Normandy, and in the Ardennes. Those 18,000 soldiers continued fighting for 2 more years because one general chose his men over blind obedience. Later, in the Falaise pocket in Normandy, where Hauser would command the 7th Army, the same dilemma would arise again. Once more, Hitler would demand positions be held to the last man, and once more, commanders would be forced to choose between obedience and survival. Paul Hauser understood something Hitler never did. Armies are not chessboards, and soldiers are not symbols to be moved or sacrificed at will. The men of Leibstandard and Das Reich were not lines on a map. They were individuals with families waiting back home. They possessed skills that took years to develop. They embodied not only fighting strength, but experience, institutional memory, and future leadership. To destroy them for symbolism was not strategy. It was waste. And in February 1943, when Germany could no longer afford waste, one SS general refused to take part in it. Kharkov would change hands once more. In August 1943, after the failure at Kursk, Soviet forces would capture the city permanently. By then, however, the war's outcome was no longer in question. The only uncertainty was how long Germany could postpone the inevitable. What Kharkov revealed in February 1943 was a reality that would shape the rest of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Courage could still win battles. Skilled commanders could still outmaneuver Soviet forces in individual engagements. But systems, integrated logistics, massive industrial output, and vast manpower reserves would ultimately decide the war. The 90,000 Soviet casualties suffered at Kharkov would be replaced within weeks. New tank brigades would be formed. Fresh armies would be assembled. With a population of nearly 200 million, the Soviet Union could absorb losses that would have shattered Germany several times over. Hauser saved 18,000 men in February 1943. The Soviet Union could lose 5 times that number and continue advancing. That was the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. It was why individual bravery, even exceptional tactical brilliance, could not overcome entire systems. But for those 18,000 German soldiers, that arithmetic did not matter on February 15, 1943. What mattered was that their commander chose them over an order issued from Berlin. What mattered was that they marched out of Kharkov instead of dying beneath its rubble. The SS Panzer Corps would fight on for 2 more years. Many of those same men would later fall at Kursk, in Normandy, and in the final battles inside Germany itself. But they would fall as soldiers in combat, not as offerings to symbolic ground. That distinction between military necessity and political illusion defined not only Hauser's decision, but the final phase of the war. The general who defied Hitler at Kharkov learned a lesson that echoed through every German defeat that followed. In modern war, the commander who preserves his forces survives to fight another day. The commander who throws away his men for the sake of symbols gains nothing, only cemeteries. Paul Hauser chose lives over prestige. Because of that choice, 18,000 soldiers march out of Kharkov alive. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to Tales of Valor for more overlooked stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from today? And which other commanders who defied orders to save their men would you like us to explore next? Your support and interaction help us keep these important historical stories alive. See you in the next episode.